The cameras were rolling, the press room buzzing with routine pre-fight chatter, until Nate Diaz leaned forward, stepped toward a reporter, and delivered a sharp, open-handed slap that echoed through MMA history. The crowd gasped, the reporter froze, and in that instant, the Stockton Slap went from gym legend to viral phenomenon. Clips spread across the internet within hours, spawning memes, headlines, and endless debate. Was it unprovoked aggression or a fighter enforcing his code of respect? For Nate, it was simple. In Stockton, words have consequences. But this wasn't just about one slap. It was the boiling point of years of tension, mistrust, and a mentality forged far from the bright lights. To understand why that hand was raised, you have to go back to where the Diaz brothers' story began, and where a single move became both a warning and a signature. Stockton, California, is the kind of place where toughness isn't a choice. It's a survival skill. It's a city known as much for its poverty and crime rate as for its resilient, hard-working residents. For Nate Diaz and his older brother Nick, Stockton wasn't just a hometown, it was the proving ground that shaped their entire worldview. The Diaz brothers grew up in a working-class Mexican-American family. Their mother raised them with grit and discipline, but resources were scarce and opportunities didn't come easy. The streets taught lessons just as quickly as the classrooms, sometimes faster. Nick, the older brother, discovered combat sports first, diving into jiu-jitsu and boxing. Nate followed closely behind, training at the same gyms, shadowing his brother's every move. Fighting wasn't glamorous. It was a way to stay out of trouble, a way to channel all that restless energy into something that could pay the bills. It was in those early years that the Stockton Slap was born. At first, it wasn't some grand gesture. It was a playful but humiliating move Nick used during sparring to frustrate opponents. A taunt disguised as a strike. It wasn't meant to knock someone out. It was meant to embarrass them, to say, "I'm in control here." Nate picked it up and made it his own. That move, open-handed, audacious, and dripping with disrespect, became a symbol of the Stockton mindset. Fight hard, fight smart, and let everyone know who's in charge. In their local gyms, it was an inside joke, but in the cage, it became a weapon of psychological warfare. The Diaz brothers weren't raised to bow to anyone. Respect was earned, and once it was lost, it was gone forever. Nate carried that code into every interaction, whether it was a training session, a contract negotiation, or a media interview. And that's the key to understanding what would happen years later. Because when Nate delivered the slap, heard around the MMA world, it wasn't just about a single question. It was about defending a lifetime's worth of principles forged in the streets of Stockton. Nate Diaz's break into mainstream MMA fame came on The Ultimate Fighter 5. From the first episode, fans noticed he wasn't playing the reality TV game. He was there to fight. His unfiltered personality and relentless pace in the cage made him a standout. And when he won the season, his reputation was cemented. In the UFC, Nate was known for two things: elite cardio and a refusal to back down from anyone. He fought the best, called out the best, and never sugarcoated his opinion. Whether it was an opponent, a journalist, or UFC management, Nate said exactly what he thought. No PR polish, no safe answers. That honesty was a double-edged sword. Fans loved him for it. His authenticity was a breath of fresh air in a sport where many fighters stuck to scripted lines. But to promoters and media professionals, Nate could be unpredictable, even volatile. The Stockton Slap became part of his in-cage identity. Against seasoned opponents, he'd mix it into combinations, not just to score points, but to get inside their heads. It was part of the psychological chess game he and Nick had mastered. By the mid-2000s teens, the slap wasn't just a move, it was a meme, a rallying cry for fans, and a symbol of the Diaz brothers' defiance. Outside the cage, Nate's interactions with the media could be tense. He didn't like loaded questions. He didn't like people twisting his words. And he definitely didn't like anyone who seemed to doubt his skills or his motives. Still, most press events went by without major incidents, until the one that didn't. The build-up to that moment started long before the reporter asked his fateful question. It started with years of Nate carrying the Stockton mentality into every room, refusing to be talked down to or disrespected. For most people, a microphone was harmless. For Nate Diaz, the wrong question at the wrong time was a fight in disguise. The slap didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during the build-up to a fight that had already been charged with tension. Nate Diaz was preparing for a matchup that meant more than just a paycheck. His opponent, a fighter known for verbal jabs and mental warfare, had been talking for weeks, stoking the fire in interviews. The UFC media schedule was packed. Open workouts, Weigh-ins and back-to-back press conferences meant Nate was constantly in front of cameras, hearing the same questions over and over. But this wasn't just standard fight hype. There was real animosity. The press events leading up to the fight grew more hostile with each appearance. Reporters, knowing Nate's short fuse, began leaning into provocative questions. Some were harmless attempts to get a good soundbite. Others seemed designed to irritate. Nate handled most of them with short, blunt answers, but his patience was wearing thin. And then there was the reporter. Not just any reporter, but one who had a history of asking questions that Nate considered disrespectful. Whether intentional or not, their tone always seemed to have an edge. Subtle digs, loaded phrasing, the kind of language that could be brushed off by most fighters but would hit a nerve with Nate. In the fight game, you learn to read an opponent's body language. Nate could read the same cues in a reporter: the smirk before a question, the slight lean forward, like they were baiting him. By the time fight week arrived, the tension between them was a quiet undercurrent every time they shared the same space. So, when the moment came, when the question crossed the line and Nate stepped forward, it wasn't an impulse. It was the final straw. The Stockton Slap wasn't about the words alone. It was about the tone, the history, and the principle that in Nate's world, some lines aren't crossed without consequence. The man across from Nate Diaz that day wasn't just a random face in the press pool. He was a veteran MMA reporter with years of backstage access, a recognizable name in fight media circles, and a style that thrived on asking the kinds of questions that got reactions. He'd covered Nate before, sat in those same chairs, asked those same sharp-edged questions, but their interactions had never been warm. Some reporters try to build rapport with fighters over time, easing tension with small talk and light banter. This wasn't that kind of relationship. Nate didn't trust him, didn't appreciate the way he phrased things, and certainly didn't think he showed the respect fighters deserved. The Diaz brothers had always had a tense relationship with the press. They came from a world where you earned your right to speak by proving yourself, not by holding a microphone. To them, many reporters, especially the ones who tried to poke and prod for drama, were outsiders trying to profit off fighters' struggles without ever having been in the cage themselves. This particular reporter had, in Nate's eyes, crossed invisible lines before, asking about injuries in ways that implied weakness, framing questions to make Nate sound like he was avoiding certain fights. Even in post-fight wins, there was always a hint of doubt, a subtle but tucked into the conversation. On that day, as the press conference rolled on, the energy shifted when it was his turn to speak. Maybe it was the way he leaned into the mic, maybe it was the half-smile on his face, or maybe it was just years of built-up annoyance. But Nate's posture changed instantly. Shoulders squared, eyes locked, every ounce of focus narrowing in on the man in front of him. In Nate's mind, this wasn't a Q&A anymore, it was a confrontation. And when the question came out, with just enough condescension in its delivery to confirm every suspicion he'd ever had about the guy, Nate didn't need to think about what would happen next. The Stockton Code was clear. When someone disrespects you to your face, you respond then and there. The room was hot under the stage lights. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, capturing every twitch and every glare. Most people in the room thought they were watching a normal exchange, another tense moment in a long week of media obligations. But if you were really paying attention, you could see it. Nate shifted in his seat, leaning slightly forward. His eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth tightening into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't neutral either. He glanced briefly at the other fighters on stage, then back to the reporter, like confirming with himself that this was really happening. The question itself wasn't long. On paper, it could have been interpreted as harmless, a probe about Nate's preparation, his motivation, maybe even his conditioning. But the tone carried an undertone, a subtle dig wrapped in curiosity. To the average fan, it might have passed unnoticed. To Nate Diaz, it was an insult. You could almost hear the moment the crowd's energy shifted. A murmur ran through the front row of media. Nate's hands weren't clenched, but they weren't relaxed either. His shoulders rolled slightly, like he was loosening up for a move he'd done thousands of times in sparring. The reporter leaned back, maybe realizing he'd struck a nerve. Maybe not. Either way, there was no undoing it. Nate pushed his chair back, stood, and closed the distance in 2 quick steps. The air in the room thickened. Nobody quite believed what they were about to see, but nobody could stop it either. In that split second, before skin met skin, there was no octagon, No cameras, no PR team ready to spin it. It was just Nate Diaz, a lifetime of Stockton lessons in his veins, about to deliver a message the only way he knew how. It happened fast. One smooth, unbroken motion. Nate's arm came across with an open hand, striking the reporter's cheek with a sharp crack that cut through the low hum of the press room. No wind-up, no hesitation. Just a clean, controlled strike that was more insult than injury. The crowd's reaction was instant, a collective gasp, followed by scattered shouts. Cameras flashed like strobe lights, capturing the exact moment the slap landed. The reporter froze, stunned, not just by the contact, but by the fact that it had happened at all. In a room full of people, in front of the UFC's media team, Nate had just reminded everyone exactly who he was. Nate didn't flinch, didn't back up, didn't apologize. He stood there for a beat, looking at the reporter with the same casual confidence he might have after landing a clean jab in a fight. It wasn't rage, it was deliberate. The Stockton Slap wasn't about losing control, it was about taking it back. Security moved in, hands up, trying to calm the situation before it escalated further. Other fighters on stage looked around awkwardly, some smirking, some clearly uncomfortable. UFC officials whispered frantically at the edge of the platform. But Nate had already stepped back, grabbed his mic, and sat down, like nothing unusual had happened. In that moment, the legend of the Stockton Slap grew tenfold. Clips of the incident hit social media before the press conference was even over. Fans replayed it in slow motion, debated the power of the slap, and dissected the reporter's reaction frame by frame. For Nate, it was simple. Someone crossed the line, and he handled it the way he'd been handling disrespect his whole life. But for everyone else watching, it was the birth of an MMA moment that would live far beyond that day, one that blurred the line between fight hype and personal vendetta. Within minutes of the Stockton Slap landing, the internet caught fire. Clips shot from multiple angles flooded Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Some came from professional cameras, capturing every frame in HD. Others were shaky cell phone videos from fans and fellow reporters who couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. The reactions were split, but passionate. MMA fans, especially the Diaz brothers' loyal Stockton army, celebrated it as an instant classic. Memes popped up overnight, placing Nate's open hand on everything from historic paintings to movie stills. GIFs of the slap looped endlessly, often captioned with Stockton 209 or Say It to My Face. Mainstream outlets, however, took a different tone. ESPN, Sports Illustrated, and even morning news shows replayed the footage alongside headlines like UFC star assaults reporter and When Trash Talk Turns Violent. Talk show hosts debated whether it was a dangerous precedent or just fight culture spilling over. Journalists in the MMA world were torn. Some defended the reporter, arguing that fighters should be able to handle tough questions without resorting to physical contact. Others admitted that certain lines shouldn't be crossed, and that Nate had simply enforced his boundaries the only way he knew how. Nate, predictably, didn't bother with damage control. He brushed off requests for interviews, only dropping a brief comment to a fan on social media. You don't let people talk to you like that. It wasn't an apology. It was a reaffirmation of his code. For the UFC, it was a nightmare and a dream rolled into one. On the one hand, they had a PR mess. On the other, the incident had gone viral, generating more attention for Nate's fight than any promotional campaign could have bought. Pay-per-view projections started climbing, and even fans who weren't planning to watch began talking about the fight after the slap. The Stockton Slap wasn't just a headline, it had become a promotional engine, a cultural talking point, and a rallying cry for fans who saw it as Nate refusing to play by anyone else's rules. But for the people in charge, it raised a pressing question. How do you handle a fighter who can turn controversy into currency? Behind closed doors, UFC executives weren't laughing. While the incident had undeniably boosted attention on Nate's upcoming fight, there were concerns about liability, media relationships, and the precedent it set. If fighters felt emboldened to physically confront journalists, what would that mean for future press events? Dana White, the UFC president, faced a delicate balancing act. Publicly condemning Nate could alienate one of the sport's most popular and bankable figures. Ignoring it entirely could send the message that fighters could do whatever they wanted without consequence. Sources inside the UFC described tense meetings with Nate's management. There were talks of fines, media restrictions, and even removing Nate from future press obligations. But the reality was simple. Nate Diaz wasn't just another fighter. He was a pay-per-view draw who could sell out arenas with a tweet. In private, Dana reportedly told colleagues, this is Nate being Nate. What do you expect? Still, the official line from the promotion was more measured, calling the incident unfortunate and reminding fighters of the importance of professionalism. The reporter involved declined to press charges, but gave a series of interviews about the experience. His tone varied, sometimes joking about it, other times making clear he didn't think it was acceptable. Each appearance kept the story alive in the news cycle, forcing the UFC to field questions they'd rather avoid. As fight night approached, the incident became part of the bout's narrative. Promotional packages leaned into the bad blood angle, even subtly referencing the slap without showing it outright. It was clear the UFC wasn't going to bury the moment. They were going to monetize it. For Nate, the slap didn't cost him the fight, the paycheck, or his place on the card. If anything, it added to his aura. And the UFC, whether they admitted it or not, had just learned that controversy wasn't a setback for Nate Diaz. It was a weapon. Long after the fight was over, the Stockton Slap lived on. It became part of Nate Diaz's mythology, a moment fans would bring up alongside his biggest wins and most iconic interview. To his supporters, it wasn't an act of aggression. It was a symbol of authenticity in a sport often clouded by scripted hype and forced politeness. Other fighters began referencing it, sometimes jokingly in training videos, other times as a taunt inside the cage. The slap became shorthand for disrespect in MMA culture, a quick way to say I own this exchange. Even outside combat sports, the clip found its way into pop culture, memes, reaction videos, and even music references. For the Diaz brothers, it was validation of the ethos they'd carried from Stockton to the world stage. Fight on your terms, speak on your terms, and never tolerate disrespect. Nate didn't go out of his way to repeat the moment, but he didn't shy away from it either. Whenever it came up in interviews, his response was usually a shrug and a smirk. The reporter moved on, continuing to work in MMA media, though the slap remained a permanent footnote in his career. In a strange way, it boosted his visibility too, his name forever tied to one of the sport's most viral moments. Years later, the Stockton Slap still circulates on social media, resurfacing whenever Nate is in the news. Fans debate whether it was right or wrong, but almost nobody denies its impact. It wasn't just a headline, it was a piece of MMA history. A reminder that for Nate Diaz, the fight doesn't start when the bell rings, and it doesn't end when it's over. And maybe that's why the moment endures, because it wasn't about violence for violence's sake. It was about principle, about a man who's lived his life refusing to bend for anyone. The Stockton Slap wasn't planned, polished, or PR approved. It was Nate Diaz in his purest form. And in the unpredictable world of combat sports, that kind of authenticity is rare and unforgettable.